that you're able to join us if you're joining us live or if you're catching this later. Today we're going to jump in. Actually, it's kind of a continuation of a recent episode we did. So recently was able to do an episode around the idea of what's called the theology of integration. The theology of integration, if you got that episode or if you're just catching this, I want to share with you is basically this idea of being able to hold the word "and" where two things can be true at the same time. The theology of integration. In mental health, we call this an emotional co-occurrence. Right? This idea that we can hold two things at the same time. I'm anxious and I'm excited. Okay, so why this continuation from the episode that we did previously? I've gotten this great feedback, and I've heard input around many individuals who have said, like, wow, that's really interesting, and it's really, really helpful to be able to have this framework where we can allow these things to coexist. And so as we jump into today's episode of Faithful Friday, I thought it would just be really helpful to talk about one of the very common experiences we have and our kind of framework of faith around that. So today's talk, it's entitled Holding Both, Embracing Joy While Experiencing Sorrow. Embracing joy while experiencing sorrow. Like Scripture talks quite a bit about these two, right? There's passages in the Old Testament, the New Testament, over and over and over that talks about joy, and there's other passages that talk about sorrow. And I think if I just lean into this from the beginning, we often have this misconception, and I think more importantly, this kind of theologically skewed idea that it has to be one or the other, that they can't coexist at the same time. But the reality is they can. And I think it's important not only that they can, but that they do, and we experience that on a daily basis. So here's what I want to do to kind of just warm us up to this idea. I want us to think about maybe we've experienced simultaneously, like we have felt both sorrow and joy. I'll give you a couple examples, like attending a funeral and having moments of laughter, right? There's sorrow, like we've lost a loved one. And then there's this kind of moment of joy because we're reminiscing about this great memory, or we're having a lighthearted moment of celebration. How about this? Celebrating the new beginning while mourning what was left behind. Like I know in my lifetime, I've moved a couple times. I've moved my family, not just from house to house, but from like across the country, from like one part of the country to another part of the country. And I remember that experience, right? I remember having this like excitement and anticipation, right? This joy about being able to go to a new place and experience new things, while at the same time like getting in the moving truck or getting in the car and having these like tear-filled emotions of saying goodbye and leaving what's behind. Or what about this one? The idea of feeling deep gratitude, right, even when struggling in hardship. Feeling great gratitude while dealing with great hardship. This makes me think of experience. The very first time I ran a marathon. I was in Northern California. And I didn't really know what I was up against, 26.2 miles, because although I had trained for it, like I didn't know it because it was my very first one. But I remember after hours of being out on the trail and like mile after mile after mile, right, finally getting to that finish line. And I had this like incredible emotional experience because I was able to hold two things at the same time. Like part of me, I was like crying because it was like one of the hardest things I've ever done, and like my body was in pain and I was aching and I was sore and I was like, I don't know if I can take one more step past the finish line. Right? And I had these mixed in with these other tears, like these other tears of great joy, this tears of like incredible sense of like pride and accomplishment, right? Because it wasn't just getting to the finish line of 26.2 miles. It was getting to the finish line of years of aspiration, right? Years of having something on my bucket list, which led to months and months and months and miles and miles and miles of preparation, of getting up early, getting out on the trail, getting my shoes on, getting in my miles over and over and over. Okay, so here's this personal example of, able to hold this idea of like, man, this is super hard, right? I don't know if I can take one more step, balanced with like, man, what an incredible experience. Okay, so I want to just dig into this with Faithful Friday, talk about, so where does this kind of fit in our biblical kind of worldview, in our framework? And so I want to use a couple examples from Scripture. So the first is in Ecclesiastes. In fact, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, we see a whole bunch of these verses, and it says, there's a time to, and fill in the blank, right? One of those is in chapter 3, verse 4 of Ecclesiastes. It says, there's a time to weep and a time to laugh. There's a time to mourn and a time to dance. Right? It's just saying that, hey, these things, like there's times when it's not just okay, but there are set aside times for us to weep, and there are times for us to laugh. There are times for us to mourn, and there are times for us to dance. Like Jesus in the Gospels of John, chapter 16, verse 22, it says, "So with you, now is your time of grief, and I will send you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy." Right? So here's even Jesus. Jesus said, hey, now is the time for grief. Like it's okay, right? Experience the grief, and I will send you again, and you will receive, and no one can take away joy. So think about this again, just these kind of examples that I kind of mentioned earlier, right? One of the ones we might think about this of sorrow and joy is, in fact, I would actually have this experience coming up myself. It's the moment of a parent being at their child's graduation. Like this is coming up for me, like just in a few months, my youngest son is going to graduate from high school. And there's going to be those moments of joy, and I'm going to be so proud of him, and I'm going to be like, this is amazing, and he's done incredible things, and, like we're going to celebrate all of that, right? But there's also this part of it of like, oh my gosh, right, this is coming to an end. Like, raising my boys, and my youngest, right, is graduating from high school, and he's moving on to new and wonderful things. But in the midst of that, there's like a feeling of sorrow, right? There's a feeling of sadness. I'm sure there will be these feelings of kind of like grief and loss, right? And so this ability, again, to hold them together. So I want to talk for a few moments of why. Why is it so difficult for us to kind of hold these two things together? I think there's a few reasons. One is, I think just have to acknowledge, I think for a lot of us in our theology, we've just not held a place for this idea of integration, or this idea of co-occurrence, right? Because we take some verses and some ideas out of context, and we have this theological construct that says certain feelings are bad, right? Like fear, anxiety, sadness, sorrow. We can go through this whole list, right? Like we've just deemed them as their bad emotions. They have no place in our lives. And certainly God would never want us to feel those things. And so we just shouldn't. But I think it's important for us to recognize, like, God, right? God, the creator of all things. God, the creator of heaven and earth. God who created us uniquely and individually in our person, right? And just in the context of humanity, God gave us emotions, right? And Jesus just talked about it, right? This is the time for grief. right? The Ecclesiastes passage, right? There's a time for this and there's a time for that. I think it's super important for us to just be able to acknowledge, like, these emotions that we're talking about, they're actually a part of God's creation, right? Actually a part of God's design. God gave us these things almost in such a way, this kind of idea of this counterbalance, right? Because in the absence of one, it's hard for us to feel the other. Like, you ever think about that, right? Like, how would we ever really truly know joy if we never experienced sorrow? How would we know what sorrow feels like if we had never had the opportunity to experience joy? And so, beyond our comprehension, like, God's amazing, right? And he has created these counterbalancing kind of experiences and emotions for us. And I think it's important that we can just recognize and embrace that, right? Without guilt and shame, without some sense of like they're bad or they're wrong. It's just be able to say, no. They're actually a part of our experience. They're actually a part of this balance in our lives, to be able to experience the full gamut of emotions. Okay, and I think another common reason why do we struggle to hold them both is I think culture and society has just done us a disservice. Like, they, we're told, like, hey, just be happy, right? Like, sure, why not? Like, just be happy, right? Like, don't think about those things. Oh, those are bad. Those are negative. Like, think happy thoughts, right? Or when we're in seasons of sadness and sorrow and grief, I truly think well-intended, we have people in our lives and culture and society of like, hey, it's just time to move on, right? Like, as if whatever you're feeling just needs to go away. And I think we can just recognize that's just not helpful. And I think we have to acknowledge it's just not healthy, right? So these social pressures that I'm not allowed to feel certain feelings, right? That I have to jump and replace a good feeling with a bad feeling, or a good thought with a bad thought. I think also sometimes we have to acknowledge that why we struggle to hold them both is there's something happening internal. Like, there's this kind of like internal guilt that somehow we like feel bad when we feel bad, right? This idea that we might feel bad when we're sad, or we get like guilt ourselves and be able to say, oh, that's bad, right? I shouldn't feel bad. Or sometimes we have the inverse experience, like this kind of mixed experience. What I mean by that is, sometimes we might actually feel happy, but we somehow have deemed that what we should be feeling right now is not happy. Like, if you ever had that moment when you're like, oh, I actually feel pretty good, but you're in the middle of something really hard and you catch yourself and you're like, I shouldn't be feeling good. It's not okay to be feeling good. I should be feeling bad, right? Or the opposite, like you're at a place where everybody's having fun and everything looks like it's great and wonderful, and you're feeling kind of down in that moment, and then there's this kind of self-judgment that kicks in, like, hey, what's going on with you? What's wrong with you? Right? Get back to just think happy thoughts, like just move on, figure it out. Yeah, so we have this kind of internal kind of guilt experience. And so here's just an encouragement in the midst of this as we keep going. Instead of resisting those emotions, what if we were simply able to just let them exist? All right, back to this idea of what if we could just put the word and in there. It's okay to feel sorrow and joy. It's okay for them to coexist. Okay, so I want to talk just for a moment about this idea of how do we integrate these two. Remember I mentioned earlier this kind of idea, the theology of integration, of holding two things at the same time. So here's a few ways we want to do it. First of all is acknowledge both without judgment. It seems easy, but actually it's pretty hard, right? I mean, just given the things that I just mentioned, right? Acknowledge both without judgment. Like, it's okay to say I'm sad and I'm grateful. In fact, notice the word and in there, right? I'm sad and I'm also grateful. Or I miss my old life and I'm also excited about this new season of life, right? being able to acknowledge both without judgment. Here's another thing I think that's really meaningful for us. It's seek moments of beauty in the midst of the pain. What I mean by that is like be intentional, right? Be intentional to find certain things in the midst of maybe where we wouldn't even be looking. Intentionally look for opportunities to allow these things to coexist, right? So take a walk in nature, listen to music, spend time with one of your favorite people, even when you're grieving, even when you're struggling. And the idea of that is being able to embrace support, embrace comfort in other people or in certain places, right? And allowing yourself to actually expand your experience by allowing both of them to coexist. And I think it's just important in the context of our conversation today that one of the ways we can integrate joy and sorrow is to lean on our faith and to lean into our faith community. Like lean on your faith and lean into your faith community. So we see this in the book of Psalms. Like King David does this. Like there's many times where he's like pouring out or kind of crying out to God, and he's filled with sadness. He's full of sorrow. But in the midst of that, he's also praising God. Like one of the great examples of this, I think it's in Psalm 42, where David, he's kind of running from his enemies. He's all by himself. He's having kind of like a meltdown, right? Like there's a moment in this passage where he's crying, and then he's got some times where he's like reminiscing, and he's grieving. And then in the midst of that, he says this to himself, and he says, "Why so downcast, O my soul? Put your hope in God." Why so downcast, O my soul? Put your hope in God. Now, I think previous to this concept that we're introducing today and the ability to hold both, this passage might be interpreted as we read it and understood that, downcast, sadness, sorrow, that's bad. Hey, David, get rid of it. Swap it out with hope. But that's not really what's happening here. What David is doing, David is just being able to acknowledge, right? Now, we don't know in that moment if he actually said it out loud, because of course it's in written form, right? But this idea for David, right? He just checks in with himself. And I love that about this passage. David checks in with himself to the point where he knows what he's feeling, right? He's feeling sadness, he's feeling sorrow, right? In this idea, why so downcast, O my soul? And he's able to acknowledge it, and he's able to hold it. And then this idea of he's got this other encouragement to himself. And put your hope in God. Like, why so downcast, O my soul? Put your hope in God. And it doesn't have to be an either or, but in this moment to acknowledge in this idea that it can be a both and. And then here's what I love about this next part of the verse. Is then it goes on to say, "For I will ever praise him, my Lord, my God." Okay, so David in the midst of this, right? I'm sad, and I'm trying to find hope, right? I'm having this experience of downcast, and I'm making a commitment to put my hope in God. And then he's got this very active response, and I can still praise Jesus in the midst of it, right? Of both. Okay, so this other part that I said, not just lean into your faith, but into your faith community, I think it's really helpful for us just to practice out and play this out with just honesty and transparency. Like, I don't know how many times this has happened to you. It happens to me like every week, right? I go to church, and there's people in the lobby at the church, and they're like, "Hey, how you doing? And how was your week?" And, just like the social accepted answer of good, fine, great. How are the kids? Good. How are you? Right? I mean, when was the last time you interact with somebody in the lobby of a church, and they're like, "Hey, how you doing? How was your week?" And you're like, "Horrible, terrible, the worst," right? Like somehow that's like, it's not okay, right? In the place where we gather with people who are like-minded and who can offer us support, right? We struggle to be open and honest and real. Or we experience frequently this idea of, we interact with people in the lobby of church or somewhere with another Christian, and we ask them, hey, how you doing? Or what's going on? Or, how was your week? And we get answers like, how you doing? Well, I'm blessed and highly favored, right? Or we get the answer like, better than I deserve. And those responses, man, is as encouraging as they might seem on the outside, right? Those statements of, I'm blessed and highly favored, right? It's a statement of like, I want to embrace that, right? How you doing? Better than I deserve. You know what it's not doing? It's not allowing space for our humanity, right? It's not allowing space for the real us who could say something like, you know what? I had a hard week and God's teaching me something through it. Or, hey, you know what? I'm struggling and God's been faithful, right? Like the depth of being able, of honesty and transparency, and allowing ourselves and even others, right? This idea of lean into your faith community, to be able to say, hey, both can coexist, both can be true. All right, so I just want to finish out with this idea of practical reflections and applications. So I want to just walk through a prompt together. So if you got a piece of paper, a journal, notepad, something, just jot these down. If you just want to keep it in your mind, if you want to pull out your phone and take a note, here's the prompt. Right now, write down or reflect on one thing that brings you sorrow and one thing that brings you joy. Okay, write down one thing that's bringing you sorrow and one thing that's bringing you joy. Like, notice I said that in present tense, right? Like something right now. Like, what's in your life? What's one thing that's bringing you sorrow? And what's another thing that's bringing you joy? Okay, take a moment, jot it down. As you do that, here's an example. Maybe for sorrow, one thing that's bringing me sorrow right now is, I lost a loved one, a friend, a family member, a pet. Maybe it's loss of a job or income. Maybe it's a loss of a connection or a loss of a relationship. Right? Identify something that is just bringing sorrow to you. And then, again, this idea of identifying something that brings you joy. So it could be something like, what's bringing me joy right now is I have an incredible group of friends that come around me and support me and are there for me and remind me that I'm not alone. Or what's bringing me joy is finding some excitement in updating my resume and looking for the next job. Or what's bringing me joy is being able to carve out some time, like just for me. Right, I'm going to the beach. I'm going for a walk. I'm getting out in nature, and I'm doing something for me. So, as we do this again, see how it's okay for these two things to coexist. Right, they can happen at the same time. All right. So last I'm going to leave you with is just this idea of a challenge. So in the week ahead, I just want you to pay attention to this. So what's one small act of joy that you can give yourself permission to experience, and one sorrow that you can do the same? So what's One small act of joy you can give yourself permission to embrace this week, even in the midst of sorrow. That's it. That's what we want to, our challenge for this week. In the midst of those moments where I'm down and I'm sad and I'm struggling, identify and give yourself permission. What's one small joy I can find in the midst of sorrow? Right, so an example of that is like I'll walk outside every evening and notice something beautiful. Okay, so in the midst of like I had a hard day, or things are really challenging right now, or I'm feeling stressed, I'm feeling overwhelmed, as we talked about today, this idea if I feel sad and down, but I'm going to make a commitment. In fact, I had this exact experience the other day. Like I had a long day, right? And I was kind of feeling it, the weight of it. So I get home, and I was able to just go out on our back patio, able to sit by the pool. Our house, fortunate enough that it kind of backs up to some water, and it faces west. So the back of our house, right, face west. And I get home at the end of the day, and it's just in time as the sun is kind of going down, right? It's going down and down and down, and there's these beautiful colors that start to show. There's this reflection over the pond, which eventually becomes reflection in the pool. There's this nice little breeze. The palm trees, are moving slightly. There's some ducks on the water, and they're playing. And I just have this moment in the midst of, like, it's a long day, a little worn out, a little burdened by what I experienced today. And I was able to just take a moment to be able to say, hey, there's something beautiful, there's something wonderful right here in the midst of it. All right, just to be able to watch the sunset and then be reminded of God's goodness, be reminded of God's glory, reminded of who He is and what He does. And you know what happened in that moment is it didn't make the challenges of the day go away, right? They were still there, right? I was able to still kind of hold them like, man, today was hard and it was rough, and man, there was a lot to it, and I'm coming home kind of carrying some. And God is good, and He does beautiful things, and I'm grateful for the sunset. Like, I'm grateful for creation. And I was able to experience that moment. That's what I'm talking about, this kind of challenge for you this week, right? Look for those intentional moments. When you think about it this week, maybe another way to think about this is even in the midst of darkness, there's still light. The reality is light can't shine unless there's the presence of darkness, right? That's another cool part of this whole idea of the theology of integration, right? This ability to allow these things to coexist. It's the same of night and day. Like, when you actually think about it, right? Like, we think about like they're separate and it's night or day, but the reality is, like, I have to remind myself and just don't forget, like, the world is round, right? So it's actually daytime all the time somewhere in the world, right? It's actually nighttime all the time somewhere in the world, right? Like from God's very design, right? This idea of and, right? So I hope this was helpful to you today. I hope this was encouraging to you today, and I hope this helpful mindset and framework, this challenge to be able to consider that you can hold these two together. Now, I would love to hear from you. You can reach out to us, through the comment section here. You can email us at coaching@livewellbehavioralhealth.com, and we'd love to hear your comments. Just know that next Monday I'll be back again for the next episode of Mindset Monday. Dr. Mike will be with us next Wednesday as we get into Wellness Wednesday. I'll be back joining us next Friday as we continue on